Graphics design. From time to time, you may find that, well, something arises that needs you to, maybe come up with a little flyer, come up with a little logo or infographic. Well, that's when your sort of latent graphic design skill actually needs to be called upon. A lot of graphics design tends to be very intuitive, but there are certain good practices that if you do actually follow them, you can create something that, well, just reads better, looks better, and feels better. Now, I'm no expert myself, but I have sort of gained some tips from here and there, and what I'm going to do is today, let's compile a small list of graphics design good practices. So yeah, that's what we're going to do today. More on this after the break. Hello and welcome back to another Random Wednesday episode. So here's the deal. Today we're going to be talking about graphics design, in particular how to actually sort of present and lay out your content so that it's easy to understand and just creates a good impression. What this means, of course, is that I wouldn't be talking too much about the content itself, though of course clearly a lot can be said about that. So I'll limit myself to saying one thing about the content before we actually jump into our tips, and that is, try not to squeeze too much content, if you know you have a certain space constraint. It's always better to err on the side of caution, have less content rather than more, because, well, with less content you can always push around the white space, but when it comes to having too much content, there's really not much you can do. So yeah, do bear that in mind before we begin. With that said, however, it is time to actually jump into our design tips, starting from number 1. First and foremost, minimize unnecessary ink. Now, I think we all have this tendency, this temptation to, try and embellish things, but the problem with doing that is that we actually make things more cluttered, less readable. That is in fact why one of the design trends of today is very simple, flat styles. The less you show, the more attention goes to the right thing, and that is your content. Of course, some of us may be kinda uncomfortable with getting rid of all the embellishments, so I guess it's okay to prioritize. Keep a very minimal amount of additional stuff if you need to, but for more unnecessary things like shadows around text, if you can avoid them, get rid of them. If they have a functional purpose, they can of course stay. Now, some of the tips I'm going to talk about later on in this episode will help you reduce on unnecessary ink further. So yeah, we'll talk about it as we get there. So let's move on now to tip number 2. Have controlled amounts of contrast and saturation. Of course, it's nice to have deep, strong colors, highly contrasting areas of text, but that actually makes it tiring for the reader to actually read. At the same time, you don't want the images to go too flat, too little contrast, of course makes things hard to read as well, because you may have trouble telling apart the foregrounds from the backgrounds, and you don't want that. So the important thing is to strike a balance. One tip I've seen that has actually been very useful to me is to generally avoid, full-on black and full-on white colors. This is a very common combination for many things, but when you do things this way, you create very extreme contrast. This may be less of a concern when actually printed out on, say, a piece of paper or a flyer, but when you're looking at something on screen, perhaps say on a website, this can be quite jarring, because ultimately a screen is bright, and having that sort of contrast just makes it kinda hard on the eyes. Instead, consider going for a grayish color for the background and a much darker grey color for the text. If you want to be fancy and change things up, light yellow and dark brown also work together very well. That's not to say you should completely avoid contrast or having highly saturated areas, but use it sparingly. Use it when you want to highlight something and when you want to make it pop out. Number 3, don't be afraid of white space. Now, I'm kinda guilty of this as well because I like to utilize my screen real estate as much as possible, and that's what I find myself doing in terms of productivity related applications. But when you're designing something for people to actually read, you may want to approach things slightly differently. Having insufficient white space can make a page feel very cluttered, and when that happens, it may be harder to actually pick out important things from the page. And don't forget, having white space means it's much easier for you to actually move things around on the page, and that can be quite important in the design process. As we move on to the rest of the tips, you'll see how white space can be used to our advantage. Now let's move on to point number 4. Pay attention to how a reader's eyes will move. Now, generally, well, we read from top to bottom, from left to right, so expect that sort of pattern. The top is the area that gets noticed first, and perhaps a user's interest may fall off as they move down. So if you have any important pieces of information, you'll want that right at the top. One interesting way to actually approach this is to build a visual hierarchy of information. This can be very useful because it channels the viewer's attention in a particular way, and that of course is dependent on how you structure your hierarchy. You want to emphasize the more important things, use a larger font or brighter colors, and yeah, place them near the top of the page. A newspaper is a very interesting example of how this is done. Now, many news articles will start with a large image, as well as a headline. This of course is what grabs the viewer's attention. There also tends to be a subtitle under the headline in slightly smaller font, but still generally large in comparison with the rest of the page. The reader can look at that and basically decide whether they want to continue on with the article or move on. This is a very simple example of a hierarchy. You start with the big important things that sort of narrow down towards the main body of the article. Tip number 5. Controlling how your styles vary. Now, here's the deal. Of course, you wouldn't want everything to look, completely uniform on your page. If you were to use the exact same fonts, the exact same size, the exact same weight, well, it's gonna look quite boring. That's not saying you can't pull it off, but generally, we'll want a little bit of variance, and that helps for a variety of reasons. As mentioned earlier, that helps you build your visual hierarchy, and that can also help you basically draw attention and emphasize certain points. But how much variance is good? How much variance is too much? Personally, I prefer, just a small amount of variance. I'll generally stick to the same font, or 2 fonts at most. One larger style can be for titles and headings, while another easily readable font for the main body text. In terms of colors, you probably want to stick to about 3. Now, how you choose these colors sort of depend on the kind of message you want to convey. One strategy you could use is to pick one color and then use 2 variants of the same color. This creates a very flat, harmonious look. Since there is very little contrast going on because, well, the colors are very related to each other, this creates a very flat, harmonious look. If you want to create a little bit more contrast, if you want to come up with something a little bit more catchy, well, consider using complementary colors. These colors are at the opposite ends of the color wheel, so expect them to stand out a lot when used in conjunction. Of course, if that's too much, you can always tone down the saturation a little, as we've described earlier in tip number 1. Now, moving on to our final tip, probably the one that sort of brings everything together, is the concept of grouping. Now, when we actually look at something, our brain is sort of coming up with associations and trying to understand things. So when you actually group things together, you're giving the reader's brain some cues about the nature of the information. The easiest way to group elements together is to just simply place them close together. Proximity is a very easy to understand cue when it comes to actually creating groups. And the cool thing about this is that it plays nice with tip number 1, and that is to minimize, unnecessary ink. Sure, I could create 2 groups by drawing a line between them, but that's unnecessary ink. Instead of doing that, I could simply just add a little bit of white space between these 2 groups. And so without using any additional ink at all, I convey the same idea. Again, this plays nice with tip number 3, white space. The more white space you have, the easier it is to actually separate things and push them around. Grouping also comes from visual similarities. Now, in this case, everything has the same proximity to each other, but thanks to the difference in color, your brain creates 2 groups anyway. So this then comes down to tip number 2, which is contrast and saturation. By being strategic with your contrast and saturation, again, you create groups. Creating groups is a very important thing because, well, chances are you have more than one piece of information to convey when you're actually creating a flyer. However, using something like a table might make things sort of feel ugly and unprofessional. So use grouping to your advantage to convey the exact same meaning. So yeah, those were your 6 general design tips. Now, of course, if you are a professional designer, you'll need to know more than that to create consistently good-looking designs. But the cool thing is, this is generally enough for most of us to get on with. The truth is, design can be a very complex thing, and a lot of it is dependent on your gut feeling, on your sort of intuitive, artistic take on how something will look at the end of the day. However, these tips will serve as good guidelines to sort of shape your intuition and push them towards the right direction. So yeah, pay attention to these, use these when you need them, and hopefully you'll create even nicer, easier to read designs. Anyway, that's all there is for this particular episode. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, you're watching 0612 TV. Thank you very much for watching. If you like my work and are feeling generous, you can shoot me a one-time donation on PayPal or sign up for a recurring one on Patreon. Of course, you can simply like, comment, and subscribe. You know the deal. For more videos, links to my channel and a related playlist are on screen. Thank you for your support.